Hey folks, welcome back. Time to look at one of my favorite supplements for the Numenera RPG, Voices of the Datasphere. I'm a big fan of this book, and part of the reason for that is that I'm a certified cyberpunk fanatic. On my shelves, I've got all the Shadowrun editions from 4th through 6th. I've got the Genesis supplement for Cyberpunk. I've got Eclipse Phase version 1 and 2. I've got all kinds of stuff, and that brings this sort of flavor to Numenera, which is great. But of course, being that Numenera is a weird fantasy sci-fi hybrid, they put their own spin on the kind of Matrix concept that you'll find in other cyberpunk RPGs. So without further ado, we'll take a quick look at the back and see the advertising blurb a little bit. So, Voices of the Datasphere contains an entirely new mode of play in which characters translate into the virtual metaspace of the Datasphere and become avatars of themselves in a bizarre and timeless realm. Explore the Datasphere itself, or use it to travel vast distances across the ninth world. There's 9 sample nodes and counter spaces within the Datasphere. There's numerous secrets of the prior world, such as the likely purpose of the Clock of Kala, long locked away within the knowledge vaults of the Datasphere, new ciphers, artifacts, vehicles, and creatures, and 2 complete adventures. Excellent. It's a great value product. I've gotten a lot of use out of this already. It's given me tons of inspiration, so I'm really excited to give you a look at it. It's got lovely end paper art here, somebody dashing away through the Datasphere with a very interesting data form for themselves here. Right at the start, they give you a rundown of their kind of inspirations, but we'll look at the table of contents quickly. So part 1 is about the Datasphere and how it works, basically. Part 2, we have the Numenera, so ciphers, artifacts, vehicles, and glitches, which are a new aspect of the Datasphere itself. Then we have part 3, creatures, so both Datasphere native creatures and real creatures that can appear in the Datasphere. And then we have the 2 complete adventures, and then an appendix which includes some useful info about how certain real-world abilities can work in the Datasphere. So it's a 160-page supplement, as you can see, but absolutely packed to the brim with useful stuff. So on the side here, you can see the sources of inspiration, everything from Existenz, Ghost in the Shell, The Lawnmower Man, of course The Matrix, Neuromancer, Snow Crash, all the classics, basically, but they really did try to put their own spin on it. So we'll get into it with the history, first of all. As per usual, they have references to the core books marked out with these symbols on the margins of many of the different pages. And what's unique about the Datasphere for Numenera is that, much like the world of the Ninth World itself, the Datasphere is kind of this tangled mix of matrices and metaverses and stuff from all the 8 previous civilizations, some human, some alien, that used to rule the Earth. So you've got deep, ancient areas of the Datasphere that contain stuff that makes no sense to a human mind. You've got much more understandable, more current stuff. You've got complex linkages between all these different things. You can have all kinds of strange encounters. They describe it as like a grove of intersecting life, a kind of AI-driven expansion of sort of parasitic fungi and neural spaces growing between each other. It's pretty cool. So when you go into the Datasphere, you never know what you might find, and that gives a lot of freedom for the GMs who want to make use of the Datasphere in adventures. Now, the key about going into the Datasphere is that you go in through a process of transcribing. So there's data scribing and there's real scribing. Now, data scribing is when you go into the Datasphere, and basically you are disassembled. So every atom is analyzed in your character, every object they carry, everything is converted into pure energy, and that energy is then projected into the Datasphere and used to build a digital model, which they call a data form. Real scribing is the reverse of that. So all the stuff that you have in your digital data form gets decoded, transmitted into like a super futuristic 3D printer kind of thing, which rebuilds all the physical patterns of the original physical counterparts of your data form. So you come back with all your items and all that kind of stuff. There are several important things that happen to you. So they're kind of lined up with quick facts here, helpfully. So to transcribe, you have to go to a place called Vertices, and there's a separate book actually called Vertices that provides a number of useful examples of these, but I won't show that today. Optimally, it can take only a few seconds, but many factors can slow this down to 1 minute, 10 minutes, or even an hour, and the reasons for that are explained later on. Transcribing leaves nothing behind. You and everything you carry are data scribed. You can't take any actions while it's happening, and if you get disrupted, you can get errors in your transcription, which is not great. Other than Numenera objects, physical objects have no effect in the Datasphere. There are some weird exceptions to this, so like if you have a really cool weapon, for example, it's basically just sort of decoration on your data form. But if you have Numenera, they do have some kind of effect when you bring them to the Datasphere. And then when you go into the Datasphere, most importantly, all your PC's 3 stat pools, might, speed, and intellect, get combined into one soul core pool, and you use that for all abilities and point costs while you're in the Datasphere. So you just have one soul core pool for everything. You make melee and ranged attacks as normal, inflicting damage according to the type of weapon that you typically use when they're in the real world. But there's important aspects to that, which we'll get to in a minute. There's some interesting stuff here about why explore the datasphere. There's a huge amount of discoveries to be made there. Nobody really knows how many nodes there are. Nobody knows if it goes on forever in some effect. Nobody knows how deep the ancient, sort of indescribable parts of it might go. So, the Orders of Truth are other organizations that are interested in uncovering the real story of the previous civilizations in the Ninth World. Might send you out on fact-finding missions, for example, to go and discover stuff. There's loads of interesting treasures there. You can find weird ciphers, artifacts, and oddities. Some of these can manipulate the datasphere in crazy ways, just deleting people or creatures or instances in a second. You can also learn a lot of history from the datasphere. So some nodes that you'll find within are basically sort of simulations of past parts of the Ninth World. So you'll find relics of old civilizations, but the datasphere will have representations of them. So you can learn quite a bit of whatever you decided is true in your campaign's history. The datasphere is a great source of finding plans for crafting. So if you have a wright in your party, or somebody else who enjoys crafting, then the datasphere is a good place to find unique plans. You can also just use it for travel. So if you describe yourself in one location and then describe yourself at a different vertice, then you could have traveled a huge distance across the Ninth World, and it's effectively instantaneous. Distance has no real meaning in the datasphere, so you can kind of wheel yourself through, if you can find a reasonable path through the nodes, of course, and end up traveling vast distances in the real world once you scribe yourself back in. Also, there's kind of a safety element to it. So in the real world, of course, you can die, you can get killed in various different ways, and if you die, you're pretty much screwed. But if you die in the datasphere, then your body becomes a sort of a husk, like it's still a data form that exists but has no animation to it. But you can take it to certain parts of the datasphere that will revive it. So death has less of a consequence, basically. You can also use it to run away. So if you have a nice quick vertice that will describe you quickly, you can hop into the datasphere and hopefully they won't follow you. So you can use it as like a hideout, basically. And yeah, so with this kind of the ability to escape and the effective immortality of being in the datasphere, there's some pretty cool reasons to dive in there just at random occasionally. So then there's some details here about how Soul Core works. So you keep your various edges and they reduce pool point costs just like in the real. So you'd still use the appropriate edge stat. So if you're doing something where the ability would use might points, then you would still use your might edge, for example. But the points that you actually use are going to be drawn from your sort of all joined together soul core pool. And the reason that this happens is because in the datasphere, concepts like might, speed, and intellect don't make as much sense because it's a data-based world. It's not real as such. So they combine it all into this soul core pool. Yeah, so there's lots of explanation about that to make it pretty straightforward. It takes a little bit of getting used to and a slight amount of mathematics at the beginning. But the useful part is that when you transfer everything into your soul core pool, when you then scribe back into the real world, you can basically decide how you want to distribute your soul core pool with your 3 pools. So if you went in and you only had 1 might point and loads of speed and intellect, for example, you could redistribute those points in any way you like when you scribe back in. So give yourself some might points back and take a few away from speed and intellect, for example. So that can be really helpful. And another reason that running away into the datasphere can be useful. Yeah, so there's a basic checklist here. So when your character describes, add up your might, speed, and intellect pools to get your soul core pool. Ask the GM if any of your abilities work differently than they do in the real, and there's an appendix about that in the back. Decide if you want to use ciphers to gain an ability from deciphering. More about that in a minute. If you have the morphology practitioner ability, decide what your appearance will be. So you can have an ability that will allow you to determine exactly how your data form looks. Typically, your data form is kind of an exaggerated version of you in the real world. So if you're a big beefy glaive in the Ninth World, when you describe, you'll be even beefier, almost like comically huge, But you can also change the way that appears with certain abilities. And in the reverse case, when you scribe, you take your current soul core points and you divide them however you like among your 3 pools, as long as you don't exceed your maximums in those pools, of course. And make a note of any of the physical forms that your scribe Numenera items will have in the real. So there's a whole thing here about transcribing equipment. Datascribe Numenera will often look very different than their physical forms do, and their objects' abilities and item level will be significant factors in their appearance. So they're basically, most items are just going to be props. Like if you have a crowbar or something, then it's just going to be, an object that looks like a crowbar, but it doesn't do anything in the data sphere exactly. But there are 2 types of equipment that are not props, and those are Numenera, which was described here, and then ideates. So, ideates are basically a kind of datasphere effect that make a creature's unusual abilities manifest in representative forms. So basically, the datasphere translates your abilities as an extension of the creature itself. So your data form can change and react based on what abilities it's using. So the example it gives here, if you have a nano using push, they might manifest a transparent separate machine hand that physically moves their target, while another might create a burst of inky black spheres that knocks the target around, and a third might blast targets with a forceful beam of intense orange light. Basically, ID8s are what allow you to make your kind of characteristic attacks that you would make in the real, and they do the same amount of damage, but their data-described appearances will be really different. And then it describes here as well that even though your great axe is kind of a prop, say, for this example character, when she attacks in the datasphere, she still inflicts the same amount of damage with a successful melee attack. So her melee attacks will look like she's hitting with a great axe, even if she, didn't have one sort of when she was data-described, because that's kind of how she normally would attack. So the idea of who you are, kind of your ID8, is almost like the platonic version of yourself that exists in your mind, and is kind of brought in with you to your data form. So ID8s exist only when the character needs and wants them. You might want to look like your sort of ID8 version of yourself, or you might want to sort of make yourself less visible and, make your traditional weapons and cool stuff kind of disappear or look differently. That's possible as well. So theoretically, just because you look like something in the real doesn't mean you have to look like something similar in the datasphere. So here they talk about different types of appearances in the datasphere, how they might exist, and also that your data form experience and appearance can change a lot depending on where you are. So if you're in a given node or frame, which is a kind of sub part of the datasphere, they might have a totally different environment that transforms everything into, shadows, for example. So every character will look like that rather than what they would normally look like. Character might temporarily manifest other effects that resemble those abilities, which is the ID8's thing. And you can learn morphology abilities that allow you to control directly what your data forms look like. And then they give you some ideas for how your data form appearances could look like depending on your foci. So there's a list here from Discovery. So stuff like if you masters weaponry, then your footprints might look like your chosen weapon, your equipment or body parts resemble your chosen weapon or are marked with the weapon's image, your weapon glows with light, energy, or some other effect such as blood or lava. If your foci speaks with a silver tongue, spoken words create beautiful sparkles, your voice is noticeably modulated to a perfect soothing tone, you have hypnotic eyes, And then there's a similar list for the foci from Destiny as well. So if you defend the weak, weaker creatures get less visible when near the character. Defended creatures gain a symbolic mark and energy connection from the character. Character grows larger and more impressive when protecting others. So it's really cool. They give you some nice ideas. Of course, you could just use these directly to give an idea of what your data form appearances might look like, depending on the foci they've chosen. There's also a list as well for the Priests of the Eons book, which I don't have. There's 4 more foci in there, which I don't have that book yet, so I can't say much about that. But it's nice that they give you all these possible ideas, and of course, as the GM, you can add or subtract details of your own design as for what a character looks like when they data describe. So then they talk about something really important in the datasphere, which is movement and range. So basically, everything is taking the form of energy in the datasphere, and basically distance doesn't really have meaning. So data forms move basically instantaneously to anywhere within the current data space. So distance is in fact irrelevant, right? So there's also no momentum. So like if you move from one part of a frame to another, you can just like instantly go to that place and you don't have to sort of risk carrying momentum over the edge of a valley or something. You just stop where you need to stop. So that means that range and distance are irrelevant for attacks within the same frame. So as long as you and your enemy are in the same sort of general area of the datasphere, then you basically treat everything as sort of all range attacks just work without modifiers based on distance. Area effects do their own weird thing. So basically area effects affect up to 4 targets of the user's choice. So again, because the datasphere knows that whatever you're doing is supposed to have like a blast effect of some kind, but because distance is meaningless and travel is instantaneous, it manifests instead as the ability to hit multiple targets, which could be anywhere, as long as they're in the same frame as you. Data barriers are really important. So if you're used to doing runs in like Cyberpunk RED or Shadowrun, this is kind of a similar thing where the datasphere is organized into nodes, which are then composed of frames, which are like little areas of space that you move through, and there tend to be barriers between these, and those are the ways that you need to kind of navigate your way through the data sphere, and which give you some challenges to overcome. So there'll be different kinds of data barriers between different parts of the data sphere. So it could be something obvious like a door, a cave entrance, a portal, etc. But some could be subtle like a hole in a tree, or something invisible, or just a hard point in space like a force field. It's possible to damage or destroy a barrier, but usually you need to use a special ability or a cipher and artifact to do this. A common way that damage manifests is as a glitch. So that could affect the barrier itself, the key to the barrier, anyone interacting with it, anyone passing through it, or anyone in the same node as the barrier. And damaged barriers can also be repaired using the Craft Numenera skill, and the assessed difficulty is usually equal to the barrier's level. So every barrier has a level, as does everything else in the game. And barriers often have keys, which allow you to gain entrance without having to go through a bunch of rigmarole. It talks about that here. So those can take a number of different forms, like passwords or a certain type of cipher, certain types of music or sound patterns, vibrational energy patterns, all kinds of stuff like that. You can also get a Datasphere skill. Basically, that's a more specialized version of the Understanding Numenera skill. So it's kind of a choice that you make as a character. Like if you think that you're spending more time, it's better for your character to have the understanding of the Datasphere rather than Numenera in general, then you might choose to take that skill and specialize. You can also, let's see, so there are various different ways that you can manifest a key, and the keys have a level, which will be the same level as the barrier they open. However, keys are just data forms like everything else, and they can be damaged like other objects. So a damaged key might just count as an asset if it's broken in some way. You can use your Understanding Numenera skill or your Datasphere skill to try and get a strong clue about what the key to a barrier actually is. So it might tell you like it's a song recording or something like that. And minor and major effects on the roll would give you even more insight and perhaps give you a clue as to where to find it. So the difficulty is usually eased by 2 or 3 steps if you get one of those effects, but some very, very secure barriers hinder this task by 1 or 2 steps themselves. There are also soul-stealing barriers, which are interesting. So basically, you can get through those by paying a cost in soul core from a given creature, which will be equal to 3 times the barrier's level, and all of it has to come from one creature, so it could be quite a lot of damage. You can't absorb, deflect, or negate the damage at all, kind of deliberately and willingly giving that energy to unlock the barrier, but it can be healed like any other kind of thing. You can do recovery rolls and stuff like that. You can also bypass barriers using code breaking skills, and there's a number of different ways to do that. Of course, you can apply effort to try and make it easier, but it takes time to code break a barrier, just like crafting basically. And I believe there's a table here. So according to barrier level, the code breaking time varies from just 1 action to level 0, which doesn't require a roll, to 1 minute for level 1, 9 hours for level 5, all the way up to approximately a month for level 10. Now, if you try to open a barrier by brute force, so without using a key, without using code breaking and stuff, you use the Understanding Numenera skill. Basically, you just have to do 1 task to try and open the barrier, but it's equal to the level of the door plus 2. And the time needed to kick a barrier is usually 3 or 4 steps faster than the time needed to code break it. You can apply effort to any kicking task that doesn't exceed 28 hours. If it succeeds, the barrier will open, but if the roll fails, it immediately triggers the barrier's hazard effects, if it has any, locks out further attempts to open the barrier for a while, usually about the same amount of time it would take to successfully code break it, and hinders opening the barrier by 2 steps for a while, usually about the same amount of time it would take to successfully code break the barrier again. So if you fail to kick a level 4 barrier in the example here, it'll trigger a hazard effect, which some barriers do have, unable to be cracked by code for about 4 hours, and any attempts to open it will be hindered by 2 steps for another 4 hours. So kicking gets you through a barrier much quicker, but it's tough, and there are a lot of downsides if you fail, so you better be pretty sure that you can make it. So some barriers can create a hazard for you as well. And there's an example here of, a D100 roll table for some sample hazards. So it could be things like, an alarm notifies all data forms on both sides of the barrier. Could be it summons or creates a guardian creature that attacks anyone passing through. Could inflict damage to equal to twice the barrier level, or to 4 times the barrier level, or could hinder all actions of anyone passing through it. It could stun you, it could inflict a minor glitch or a major glitch. All of those things are bad. One interesting thing you can do when you data scribe is that your Numenera devices go with you, right? But you can choose to absorb the energy from discrete Numenera objects like a cipher or an artifact, temporarily gaining an ability of their choice when they finish data scribing. This process is called deciphering. So many ciphers have abilities that aren't particularly useful in the Datasphere. So you could choose instead to kind of decipher it, and then you gain a different ability, basically. The cipher is gone completely. When you leave the Datasphere, the deciphered item is gone forever. It doesn't get real scribed again. And so then you can gain a new ability. So, for example, common choices would be to heal soul core points equal to the level of the cipher, maybe gain 1 armor for 1 hour per cipher level, 2 armor if the cipher level is 6 or higher, create a daemon automaton data form like an instant servant cipher, and it would exist for 10 minutes per level before disappearing. Or you could create an object data form that represents a piece of information you know, like a memory, words to a song, the contents of a glimmer, or a Numenera plan, blah, blah, blah. So there's lots of cool options. I mean, you can take a cipher that is useless to you in the datasphere, and if you don't know how long you're going to be there, then it can well be worth deciphering a specialized cipher or artifact even, just to get you something useful that you can actually affect the datasphere with, instead of something that is very specialized for an effect in the real. When you're in the datasphere, as mentioned before, you kind of turn into a husk when you die, and you could pick it up and move it so your party can kind of carry it along, and then there are different Numenera devices like husk reconstitutors and sepulchre staffs, and they repair a husk basically, so they bring you back to life. So death is much less meaning in the datasphere. Time basically seems to run at the same speed as the average human brain, so if you're in the datasphere for 11 hours, then 11 hours have passed in the real. But there are some regions where that's not the case, because some creatures that may have existed in prior ages, they had a faster clock speed, basically, so they experience time faster or slower. So you might be able to take 2 actions on your turn if you were one of those creatures, for example, in one of those kind of frames. As far as sustaining yourself in the datasphere, it's really easy. You don't need to eat, drink, or breathe. You're just a being of energy, so you still feel the need to rest. And you can get fatigue, but basically, if you can consume objects that would typically make you feel better, like pill ciphers or eating a data form version of a fruit or something, it'll give you a positive effect in the same way. It's like a placebo effect, sort of. Some ghosts and evos feel something similar to hunger, so they crave hunger for information and may feed on some of these things in the datasphere, but they don't seem to starve or die if they don't do these things. So it could be that this behavior is just sort of a leftover, because they don't actually need to consume anything to remain alive. Well, not alive, but unalive or whatever. Real scribing creatures. So this is about, turning back to the real world and what happens to you. Of course, when you real scribe objects, if you've deciphered anything, then that won't come back at all. But objects that were in the datasphere will come back in the form that they originally were, so your weapons, your random oddities and stuff like that. If you have objects that you created in the datasphere, they can be real scribed just like objects that originated in the real and were later data scribed. So you can kind of make something in the datasphere and take it out with you. Then if you spend XP, you can gain an intuitive understanding of your data form and learn how to control it. So if you're a dilettante, you can decide your coloration, species, apparent non-Numenera equipment, and so on. If you're a practitioner, you can choose a new appearance every time you data scribe. If you're a morphology master, and you spend 0 or 2 intellect points, then you can change your data form as often as you like by spending intellect points when you're in the datasphere. So you can just change it any time, except for when you're transcribing, of course. But that costs more XP. Or you can just, forget about it and not worry about it. But being able to change your data form, your morphology in the datasphere can be really useful, because there are creatures that are native to it. They may react very differently depending on what your data form looks like and what you appear to be to them. Then we have an example of play in the datasphere, which is very handy for the GM because it is a very different environment. The experience of being in the datasphere is very, very different from being in the real. Another unique aspect is you have the voices. So they're kind of godlike entities. I guess they're basically thought to be advanced beings. They could be super AI. They could be, some kind of super being that either emerged in the datasphere or was transcribed there from some previous transhuman age or something. But the appearance of a voice in the game, according to the GMing section, should be like a paradigm shift. Suddenly you can travel vast distances at will. You can travel to the source of information and act it directly. When you get to the datasphere, everything is different. Your players might feel like, we're doing pretty well here. But then voices are really a humbling experience. They bring your characters back down to earth and make you realize that, in fact, these are powerful and real entities that, they have their own fanatics, their own cults, their own believers and servants that can do things for them. They have the ability to restructure and kind of destroy and create parts of the datasphere at will. So they give examples of, think of the voices as the weirdest potential of the Numenera. In the real, local Numenera effects might negate gravity, compress distances, create mutations, or attract bizarre creatures. In the datasphere, all of those things are the norm, so the weird of the datasphere has to be even weirder to stand out. Pick 1 or 2 traits for a voice and have its presence, agents, and overall goals push those traits in frames. An archivist voice might insist on scanning every creature in order to craft a miniature version of it for a menagerie. A speed-obsessed voice might leech the clock from other creatures or entire nodes, creating time-slowed prisons. An entertainer voice could hire or brainwash creatures with the intent of building an elaborate performance for an unknown entity. So all kinds of weird stuff can happen when you introduce these super powerful creatures. So then the next section, chapter 4, is about the spaces that make up the datasphere itself. So you use a vertex to go in, of course. That'll deliver you into a frame, and that frame and the frames connected to it make up a node. So it talks here about the different kinds of vertices that you can find. Some can sort of data describe you only or real describe you only, not both. Some are not fixed in place. Some are hard to use, some are easy to use, and there are many variations, basically. Datasphere mapping, judging by this, is not so easy. Finding vertices and finding nodes and frames and the connections between them and the barriers that get in your way cause that to be a bit of a challenge. So there are a number of different ways that vertices can behave. They might need repair. They might act as a sort of an easy form of transport, but then make it really hard to come back. All kinds of stuff can happen. We're in the Numenera world, where tech is, potentially millions or even billions of years old. So when you first come into the datasphere, you appear in a frame, which is like a room, but it's a data space. So again, it's kind of a conceptual space. It's like imagine the loading room in the Matrix, where they have this kind of white nothing, but more detailed than that. It'll appear to be something like a corridor or a room or, a forest or a house or something. It's decoration. It doesn't really do anything, but the frame has some kind of appearance, and each frame will have a level. The level of the frame will be the difficulty of any task to bypass the barrier to another adjacent frame. And each frame will have an interior environment. So it might appear to be a city street or the inside of an inscrutable machine, but whatever the environment, it doesn't affect the creatures directly, basically. There will be adjacent frames, often several. Typically, you can't see into your adjacent frame because the edge of the frame acts like a barrier, sort of blocking off these different areas of data. But you can try to peer into an adjacent frame by doing an intellect task that is hindered by 2 steps. And if you do that, you can get a blurry view of the next frame's environment. You can move between adjacent frames using an action. The nature of the environment determines what that looks like. So if you're entering a frame with a forest environment, you might appear on the other side, like emerging from a copse of trees. So a challenge for the DM, of course, will be to sort of come up with concepts for these frames, how they interact, and what it's like when you transfer between them. What are the qualities of the frame? Is it faster or slower than normal? What kind of creatures are there? What are the constraints of being in there? What does it appear like? When you transfer between frames, what is that experience like? So there's a lot of openness to the datasphere because it is so different from the real, but it's not the easiest thing in the world to GM, that's for sure. So then it talks about nodes. These are a collection of frames, and then you have conduits, which are connections between nodes. So as you get through frames, you might get to the end of some sort of node, which often have like a related theme. And then you can reach a conduit, which will bring you to a different node, which will also have a level at that conduit. And if the conduit is locked, then that level will tell you the difficulty of the task to bypass the barrier and get to the next node. You can't really see what's on the other side of a conduit. You just have to kind of go through it. And some are one way, and some have more than 2 endpoints. So you might end up going into the conduit and realizing you have a couple of choices on where to go. And then there's some information here which is really helpful for both players and GMs about how to navigate in the datasphere. So what a default frame environment might be, what the experience of touching things is like. With skill with understanding Numenera, you can attempt to call a special function of the datasphere in almost any frame, but they might not initially realize it. Basically, you can call a daemon helper. So this is kind of an automated program that's equal to the frame's level. And it shows up like a floating glowing window in which there's kind of a question mark. And you can use the window by talking to it or writing on it and try to understand your surroundings. You can also try to learn about adjacent frames, and you can ask the datasphere questions. But that also kind of brings you attention in the datasphere, and that might not necessarily be a good thing depending on where you are and what you're doing. And since there are many paths through the datasphere, you'll want to sort of wander about and either rely on general directions and simple explorations, or you might just try and find somebody who knows where they're going, who has a route mapper of some kind. So they have a recommendation on how to keep track of where you're going. Get dice in a pad, choose a place to start, roll on the conduit features or the node themes table, and then you can kind of generate things on the fly, basically. I think that's a pretty cool idea, and it adds some like player participation element. You can get all kinds of different node themes like creature evolution, like laboratory theme where it's about automaton behavior, or dark matter. Could be about monitoring sites in the real alien storm-tossed world, or universal expansion or something. All kinds of neat themes. Then, roll for the Vertices transport hub and what that's like. If there's a foundry or a population center, what's going on there. And then there's frame generation tables as well. So there's a frame features table, what it actually looks like. So it could be, for example, a field of white cubes that constantly takes on new shapes. Could be globes of fluid-like material that lazily float through the frame, all kinds of stuff like that. And there's many, many options there. It just keeps on going. And then you have frame qualities. So these are kind of aspects that can make it alternately more challenging or easier to work with in this particular frame. So, for example, you might have a glitch that inflicts the frame's level and damage every round, which means you want to get the hell out of there. You might be rendered so that you have two heads and one of yours has no impulse control. You might have data forms all rendered as fish and breathing water. I mean, all kinds of weird stuff can happen. Then frame content in terms of creatures as well. So there might be some native creatures from the datasphere living around here, either creeping around the exterior of the frame or hanging out and glitching out in the middle of it. So you want to watch out for those. Then there's some example vertices and nodes. I won't go into these too much because, it's more fun to discover these on your own. But there's some nice examples of sample vertices. And the first one is kind of the most detailed one. So it's a tall ruin of spiky glass and metal. Got its name from the mirror-like surfaces that cover many of its interior walls. The mirrors are actually glass Numenera screens projecting images that seem like reflections, but usually have some details distorted or missing. So there's a projection room, there's an automaton patrolling around, and then there's a vertice room where you can actually data scribe. And the datasphere side has its own appearance described as well. Then there are some various other examples here. Snesic, Malagort, Acrothorm. And this forms the kind of example node here. So there's this arena cube. There's different locations in the frame that you can go to, each with kind of barriers in between. And then describes, what the experience is like as being in each of those areas. Then we have more descriptions of these areas along with some rumors as well for explorers. We have some people that you can meet, including the Four, a disparate but allied group of data forms, have overstayed their welcome in the node by centuries. Each has a special key allowing them to bypass select rules that are normally part of the Baratrum experience, essentially allowing them to cheat or alter any experience however they please. Control can't touch them because of these same keys. Possibly useful for the PCs, I would say. So there's lots of interesting experiences you can have here in this node. They give you some examples of things the players can get up to. Here's another example node, Tourbillon. So it's got a pearlescent catchment frame inside which hundreds of other unfixed frames swirl around a central deletion zone. So it kind of serves as a sink for broken and corrupted frames from across the entire datasphere. So that kind of gives you this sort of swirling vortex effect here. The deletion zone, of course, is kind of not a place you want to go. It exerts an attractive influence on unfixed frames and initially subtle draw on other objects or creatures in the node. It's easy enough to resist, but it becomes an issue if an object is not tethered or held by a character, or if a character is dazed or otherwise rendered helpless. If you fall into the deletion zone, you suffer 30 points of damage. If you die from this damage, you're deleted from the datasphere, so don't do that. And there's basically tons of frames tumbling through here. There are some that are persistent, which are described here. So you have like an aquarium with an ocean floor. You have red clouds stretching away in all directions in the clouds frame. You have a glitching storm-tossed frame. You have the Morden home, and you can randomly determine frames, of course. And of course, there are tables for this, along with a few rumors about this node. Then we have the Library of Ilem, which is a super node of other nodes, a place where you can find loads of information. It's a good place for research. There's a kind of librarian creature, which is a kind of demon that can help you out. You can find information about all kinds of topics in the datasphere, which is another great thing about adventuring in the datasphere. You can put in requests for information about almost anything. So, for example, besides information, you could put in a request to bring up an instance of a particular datasphere cipher. The task will be hindered, but it's an intellect-based task. If it's successful, you get a random cipher of the requested level, which you can then claim. You can also request artifacts, however the task is hindered by 4 steps instead of 1. There'll be other library visitors as well. So there's some voices that show up here, so you got to be careful. There are various other independent beings, and the prime librarian is kind of in charge of the place. Then there is a nice sidebar here about working out difficulties for if you want to ask the datasphere something, either through a demon or through the library. So level 0 is commonly known stuff. You don't really need to roll for that. Level 1 is simple knowledge, so what's an Aeon Priest? Level 5 would be stuff that only a handful of people would know. Level 7 would be secret information. So what's the password to get into, whatever weird place? Level 9 would be secret personal information known by only one person. And level 10 would be lost information that's not recorded directly in the datasphere, or at least not in a layer that's easily accessible. So that gives you a good idea and guidance as a GM as to where you might find some useful information. and how difficult it would be to find it. So then we talk about some ancient demons called Mercurials, using the special collections in the library, and then the architecture of the ancient datasphere, which to me is really interesting. When a dataform is transferred, falls into, or pulled into, or otherwise finds itself in an ancient layer of the datasphere, their experience becomes fragmented. Their dataforms are physically and mentally inadequate to the architecture, and they can typically sense only a tenth or a hundredth of what's going on. So most ancient layers do not simulate gravity, light, heat, pressure, or other environmental factors. The only sense a dataform can use is a thin channel of communication with their surroundings. Basically, every round you need to spend an attempted intellect-based task try and work out what the hell's going on. Each minute you remain, your dataforms gradually degrade, thanks to the incompatibility of your dataform with this ancient architecture. If you can try to enter an ancient layer in search of knowledge, then you can try to sort of fish for making sense of nonsense, it says. It's like asking the datasphere for an answer, but the tasks for all such questions are eased by 4 steps. So you can actually find some pretty privileged stuff down here, but it is significantly dangerous, and you can easily go mad and lose lots of time and effort trying to make sense of it. So the dangers, it's hard to see them coming because you have only partial protection. And if you want to return back to the world of regular nodes, frames, and conduits, you can try to access functions of upper layers. So it's kind of like escaping a barrier blocking between 2 frames. And it requires a number of successes equal to the level of the ancient layer currently holding them. So it's kind of a multi-effort task. Then we have some more example nodes. The Valenka Foundry. Dataform is treated to a view of a metallic red landscape rolling away in every direction. The sky is a gray non-space on which stylized schematics are faintly impressed. It's a foundry node, and if the PCs can access proper controls, they can synthesize a variety of items that, when finished, take the dataform object of a seed. If the seed is taken via vertices back into the real, it can be induced to grow into an actual object, often an installation, vehicle, or automaton, over the course of a few minutes or hours. So again, loads of cool stuff to be found in these kind of places in the datasphere. There are guardians, of course, in the foundry, so you got to be careful of those. It gives you an idea of the general layout, and then you can use the foundry for crafting, but it works a little bit differently because you need to create these seeds, basically. When you conclude the crafting process in the foundry, you get a metallic seed, and that is concentrated information. So once you real scribe back into the real world through a vertice, then you can germinate it, and you can get all kinds of stuff as a result. So the commonplace, or the kinds of things that can be crafted in Valenka Foundry, include the commonplace items and Numenera plans available for crafting in Numenera Destiny. So that's quite a lot of things. I mean, that includes vehicles and like buildings and all kinds of cool stuff. Then you have Verse, which is an entire world revolving in the night, glistening with illumination, outlining continents as well as superstructures so large that many reach into space. Flying vehicles and or creatures which must be colossal to be visible at the same scale as the planet pass over the surface in great streams. Stamped plainly on the surface are 3 symbols in an alien alphabet. Each letter must be the size of a small continent. This is the view visible from Verse's entry frame. Most of the node is a vast simulation of a world, containing billions of instances of different creatures and beings, all unaware that they are demons and ghosts with a fake existence that has spun on for millions of years since it was last rebooted. So it looks beautiful and cool and lively until you realize that basically everybody is a program, not realizing the reality of their kind of eternal trappedness. There are some watchers scattered throughout as well. They're a mixed bag consisting of demons from other nodes, wandering or lost dataforms, or other dataforms who become absorbed in following a particular simulated entity group or historical trend in the simulation. There's also some security. There are soul catchers that are drawn to full simulations like Verse. They are level 6. They perform stealth tasks as level 8. Their attack siphons knowledge and identity as it inflicts damage, so that sounds bad. Then there's stats as well for Watchers and for Larens, which are kind of spies in the Verse. And then there's an observation layer, so you can just take a look at stuff. There are control pods. You can alter the environment and the qualities of Verse. And then you have a simulation door. Entering it gives permission for the frame to inject the creature into the world of Verse, which means altering their body to fit in among the creatures that believe Verse is real. Without some kind of protective ability, cipher, or pass, most who enter through the simulation door never return. Entrants forget who they once were. Even if somehow reminded, recalling one's previous existence is an intellect-based task with a difficulty equal to the node's level. So, yeah. You get trapped in Verse, which is not great. Yeah, so I guess there's Yoltar, another node, which is like kind of using space as a model. So you can see on the map here, you have different planets, and when you're hopping between frames, you're kind of hopping between planets. And there's even like an asteroid belt and a sun and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of a simulation in sense of space travel. You've got some kind of horrible space jellyfish there. I don't know what that's about. I like that there is a main planet called Haskell. It's a nice reference to, real world programming. There's descriptions here of the various planets, the peoples that can be found there. Then we have glimmers. So glimmers are basically moments where the datasphere kind of bleeds through into the real. And they're malfunctions of the datasphere that kind of poke through. They're bursts of data that are often nonsensical and sometimes disturbing. It might be like lost data forms sending glimmers to hope for rescue, predatory demons hoping to lure data forms for their resources, autonomous processes randomly firing, voice probing for what it considers to be sapient life in the ninth world, or an entity of a prior world trying to reunite with another of its kind, all kinds of stuff. And there's examples of typical glimmers here for the GM as well. You could also send glimmers, so you would call a demon helper, and then instead of asking a question, you formulate your message and attempt to send it. The more complex the message, the higher the level of difficulty would be. So a message to someone in the real is a level 5. A more complicated glimmer that would use the forces of the datasphere to provide additional benefit would begin at level 7 and go up from there. Being able to send glimmers is pretty cool, but they can also trick you if you're in the real. Don't necessarily take the glimmer for a genuine message. It may be a lure from a datasphere-based organism trying to harvest your resources or do other bad things to you. Then we got loads of new ciphers. So there's a cipher list here. These are things that can help you in the datasphere. So basically, like the address traversal, the user and up to 6 additional creatures are pulled into a temporary conduit, immediately removing them from the frame. It provides a one-way trip to another node in the datasphere that the user specifies and knows to exist. If you don't specify a node, you appear in a random node, and you use the root mapper system to generate a random frame in a node. There's things that collapse barriers, that soothe barriers, make them easier. You can accelerate or inhibit the clock speed. You can collapse nodes, which is pretty intense. You can construct machine instructions. You can strike down conduits. You can connect to data. You can morph your data form, either slightly or radically. You can use a data form disarranger to interfere with the normal functions of a creature data form. You can use a debilitative poison, which hinders the target's actions. You can inflict a random emotion poison for 1 minute, target them with a minor glitch, or a major glitch for cipher level 6 or higher, or you can split a gestalt data form into its individual components. So lots of cool Datasphere specialized stuff in here. There's a load of new interesting ciphers. Frame Obliterator. An adjacent frame is deleted. Creatures and objects in the frame whose levels are higher than the cipher level automatically appear in a frame adjacent to the deleted frame. All other creatures and objects in an attempt a might defense roll against difficulty of half the cipher level to avoid deletion and appear in an adjacent frame. Wow. You can also correct minor glitches. You can create gravity spikes. There's a sidebar here about what a gestalt data form actually is. You can spawn an instance. You can create traps of various types. You can meld frames together. You can create protective frames. You can attack a creature in an adjacent frame. You can do a recursive deletion at a level 10 extreme. So it triggers the same effect as a frame obliterator or data form obliterator. In addition, if the deletion is successful, all records of the target are also expunged from the datasphere. So that means new instances of the target cannot be created later or restored, even if using restore from Datasphere Extreme Cipher, because the Datasphere has completely forgotten the target ever existed. So yeah, that's pretty hardcore. You've got smart frames, you've got duplicate spawns, you've got a soul core tracer, so you can follow a target. You've got tornadic spiking, you've got transcribing transformers, an enhancement leading from the datasphere to the real. You can have transcription accelerators or shields. You get a universal key that can open a locked node, conduit, frame, or barrier, and succeeds at a code breaking task if the lock level is equal to or lower than the cipher level. Very, very handy. Artifacts. So you can have a battering sledge. It functions like a normal ID8 weapon in frame and like a normal heavy weapon in the real. So it doesn't have a depletion roll when you're using it. When its special power is activated, it activates a Vertice-like transcription wave throughout a frame. Creatures in the frame or area must succeed on a might defense roll or lose their next action when the entire frame shakes as if in the grip of an earthquake. In a datasphere, the frame gains a minor glitch. In the real, objects are toppled or moved at least 5 feet. And cracks form in the walls, floors, and ceilings. If you attack a conduit, successful attack induces a kink in the conduit, effectively hindering all tasks to use it by 3 steps. So that can be helpful if something is chasing you from one node to the next. You've got Cipher Cutter Swords. If you successfully hit a dataform creature, one cipher carried by that dataform, whose level is lower than the artifact level, is immediately destroyed. If used on a barrier, it attempts to gain an asset. You can also spawn demons. You got a data razor, which basically gains you some soul core points equal to the damage dealt. You've got deletion razors. So if you trigger the special function and you hit a data form, the data form is deleted from the datasphere as long as its level is lower than the artifact level. You've got nanosculpting stuff. You've got info disks. Vulnerable parts of the wearer's soul core are stored within, providing the wearer +1 to armor. You've got soul core guards, which is a shield-like glyph. Becomes a shield-like emblem on your chest. Defense rolls against acquiring glitches, and the harmful effects of glitches are eased by 2 steps. So lots and lots of cool stuff in here. Then we got some vehicles as well. So there's the Armored Hulk, which is an enclosed vehicle for up to 3 people. I mean, they look pretty cool, gotta say that. There's the Conduit Mole. So it's an enclosed transport vehicle, provides cover and 1 armor to anyone inside it against attacks from outside. They can dig their own temporary conduits, allowing the pilot to take the vehicle to any known node, but doing so is a slow process that takes minutes or hours depending on unknown factors. The advantage of using a mole is that its operation is stealthy. The vehicle and everyone inside it are effectively undetectable while digging a temporary conduit because it's not connected to any known parts of the datasphere. It's very cool. We have the Dreadnought, which is a very large enclosed transport vehicle, presumably this guy here. So it can carry dozens of people as well as a tank or flyer. Provides cover and 4 armor to anybody inside of it. In frames that have quality where movement works as it does in the real, it can fly a long distance each round, but it can't enter smaller frames. And if the frame is too small, it kind of acts as its own adjacent frame. Some of them are equipped with a ranged weapon that is like some of the artifact weapons described in the Datasphere Artifacts chapter previously. We've got Nodospheres, which are enclosed 2-person vehicles. We have the Nodo Wing, a fast enclosed vehicle that can hold up to 3 people. It is usually keyed to a specific node, allowing it to pass through certain barriers inside the node without having to use an action to do so. So in effect, you have free movement within the node if you're using the Nodo Wing. It's pretty cool. Then you have the Webflower, a long spindly vehicle. Carry about 20 people, all of whom are exposed on the stem portion of the transport. So let's see, designed for long distance transport, it can move through open barriers without the pilot using an action. Cannot enter smaller frames. When acting as its own adjacent frame, the Webflower and its passengers can enter and interact with the adjacent frame as if there were an open barrier between them and the Webflower's level is equal to or greater than the frame's level. Okay. Some Webflowers have the ability to create their own temporary conduits, allowing the pilot to take the vehicle to any known node. But using this ability requires a depletion check. Depletion is 1 in 10, and you check once per day of use, so that can be a problem. We've got a whole chapter on glitches. So these are problems that can happen in the datasphere. They can be stealthy, so it might not be obvious that something is wrong, or they could be obvious with, some kind of glitchy noise or image or light or even a scent. You can get glitches from data scribing, like if you get attacked when you're data scribed or something like that, and they tend to persist as long as the creature remains in the datasphere. If you real scribe again, then the glitch will be erased and your physical body will return to normal. But there are certain glitches that can continue to affect you or can cause some mutations. Some glitches are viral. You can roll on tables here for some random glitches. So these can be things like altered ideates. So your ideates look strange in some way, too big, too small, too colorful, whatever. You emit a constant loud alarm noise, which hinders hearing tasks for all creatures in the frame and hinders your stealth tasks by 3 steps. You can have distorted senses, extreme morphology alteration, mild hallucinations, lag, tactile hallucinations. You can be phase shifting every few seconds. You can be slowed, you can be severely corrupted, so all actions are hindered by 2 steps. And these are just minor glitches, by the way. Major glitches are real bad, so there are things like sending out pulses of energy every hour, inflicting 2 points of damage to all creatures in the frame. You can corrupt your ciphers. When you use an artifact, make 2 depletion rolls. You take 2 points of damage every hour. It can delete your equipment. You can get soul core sickness, so all the damage you inflict is halved. All kinds of bad stuff can happen. Then we've got the listing of Datasphere creatures. There's only a few of these. The abstracts, they are a perfectly shaped silhouette of just 2 dimensions. And they suck energy from other data forms by leeching them of their 3-dimensionality. So they're kind of glitches that evolved into creatures. They hunger for energy. They've got 12 health, 1 damage inflicted, but it ignores armor. And then you have to succeed on an intellect defense roll. If you fail, you immediately descend 1 step on the damage track. If it destroys you using that, your husk remains, but that becomes a new abstract within an hour unless the husk is destroyed, deleted, or otherwise dealt with. Hopefully revived if it's one of your players. Then we have the frame creeper. These horrible looking dudes, they creep around on the exterior of frames. So they spawn an instance into a frame interior, which in turn bites a target in the frame as part of the same action. If 2 or more spawned instances attack the same target, whether they inflict damage or not, they leave behind a filmy web draping their prey that inflicts 1 point of damage, ignoring armor, each round until the victim uses an action to shed the substance. Successfully attacking the frame creeper's original instance is possible from inside, but unless the PCs have something that allow them to attack outside their current frame, their attempts are hindered by 4 steps. So basically, it can screw with you inside the frame, but you really just have to struggle to hit it on the outside, and that's the original manifestation. So if you really wanted to stop messing with it, you got to get to that original one. Then we have frame breakers. So these are big old level 7s. When a frame breaker reaches a new node, every data form in it knows. Environments flicker, the apparent sensation of a booming shutter is felt, and invoked messages begin to flash. So the demon appears as a jumble of previously broken frames that mold and fold themselves around a central glowing face, leaking energy, data, and tiny bits of dissolving frame. Could target an individual data form, inflicting 7 points of damage, but it's more likely to attack the frame itself, which effectively damages everything inside. It can attack a frame every other round. Either the current frame or an adjacent frame is deleted if its level is equal to or lower than the frame breaker's level. Then, as we saw before, if you're in a deleted frame, you have to do a might defense roll. And if you succeed, then you'll reappear in an adjacent frame. In this case, if you fail, you take 7 points of damage ignoring armor and immediately descend 1 step on the damage track, and then pop up in an adjacent frame. The frame breaker is immune to all of this and simply appears in an adjacent frame. So just love destroying stuff, basically. We've got the Genius Vertices. Some vertices that access the Datasphere are relatively simple. Other vertices are warded with the Genius Vertice, which protects them against damage, abuse, or flag to creatures or individuals. They're biomechanical humanoid figures with twin miniature vertices for hands. So they perceive and defend at level 7. They're typically level 6, as you can see. They can activate its hand vertices as a single action to make 1 or 2 attacks, to call an ally from the Datasphere, or make 1 attack and call 1 ally. In the real, its attacks target foes within long range with a reality scrambling beam. They take 6 points of damage, so their bodies are partly shredded. So basically, parts of you are being data scribed, but not all of you. And you must make a might defense roll or take an additional 6 points of damage. Ouch. Calling an ally, real scribes or data scribes an instance of a creature that is recorded in the Datasphere of up to level 4. So they could bring in some abstracts or, these guys. Engines. Yeah, so you don't want to mess with those. If you're on their naughty list and they don't want you to data scribe, then watch out. These guys are kind of weird isosceles triangles creatures. They're active only in the Datasphere. They're triangular red creatures with tube-like proboscises, akin to swarming packs of predatory fish. If a target is ingested with enough bad information, upon death it disassembles into raw data which engines ingest directly. So they hunger for data, and they inject you with bad data until you kind of burst into raw data that they can ingest. They are only level 3, but they're always seeking new prey, and they tend to hunt in schools. So it says a school of 4 or more, concentrate on a single foe, and make 1 attack as if they were a level 5 creature, inflicting 8 points of damage, and on a failed might defense roll, 2 points of damage each round. A large number of engines can make a harrowing combat encounter. The creatures might linger in a low-power hibernation-like state around a vertice, waiting for unwary characters to data scribe. That'd be a pretty shitty way to be welcomed into the Datasphere. And we have the Maestrins. They are vicious data ghosts, able to act within the Datasphere and in the real, usually without having to use Vertices to make the transition. They replicate themselves and corrupt data or physical systems whenever they can. So they can batter 2 targets within immediate range each round. It can touch a device up to level 7 and attempt to seize control of it. It can use the control device to electrocute a user, explode, or do something else within the device's capability to attack. In a frame, it inflicts 5 points of damage on other creatures or systems. Damage targets that fail an intellect roll come under the Maestrin's control. So yeah, not great. The Mercurials. They are sometimes forlorn and in need of aid, other times terrifying and dangerous. These truly ancient ghosts and voices might well be much more powerful than when they were encountered in their native deep layers of the Datasphere. However, those layers are deprecated, fragmented, and in many cases not properly connected to the network. Because of that, they have trouble interacting with the architecture of the more current data frame areas. So they're kind of very changeable in form, and they're also a bit damaged and insane. They have 1222, inflict 2 points of damage. They can call up a new sort of attack every round, although not necessarily the best one for the situation. A fallback attack generates a flash of malignant data that inflicts 6 points of damage on a failed intellect roll or traps them in a temporary frame until they can escape. Alternately, it can enter or leave a frame at will. It can turn invisible to data forms for 1 minute, or craft a custom conduit to lead to any other node in the Datasphere, so they can run around pretty easily. We've got the Nectom Wave. So they are in the truly primordial layers of the Datasphere constructed by the earliest of the prior worlds. A Nectom Wave might be one specific creature or just one member of a species of similar creatures. One moment they might appear as an inert solid, often a milk-white monolith carved with strange glyphs, and the next the whole thing might collapse into a wave of white fluid that crashes over its victims. When the wave reassembles, sometimes those victims are gone, okay? They can do tasks related to accessing ancient layers of the Datasphere as level 9, okay? Their attack is to temporarily drown all creatures within immediate range. in his briefly liquid body, inflicting 6 points of damage that ignores armor. You also must succeed on an intellect defense roll or descend 1 step on the damage track. If you drop 2 steps on the damage track due to a Nekton wave attack, you get transferred to an ancient layer. Wow, and that can be difficult to get out again. If the Nekton wave is destroyed, however, all victims with transfer within the last week are coughed up out of its decaying form. Then we've got the Null Strider. So they are powerful entities that exist in the space between frames, nodes, and conduits. So some of these are voices. Some of these are these Null Striders that don't fall into an obvious category. They seem to pass from node to node as if striding upon them from a layer not accessible by any other creatures. It's only when one of its midnight limbs crashes through one or more frames of a node that dataforms recognize that something vast moves among them. They are level 9, by the way, not to be messed with. Their motive is destruction from the point of view of a dataform and a node touched by a Null Strider. Their one or more limbs or organs can appear almost anywhere. They have 130 health. They inflict 17 points of damage and have 5 armor. Wow. During any round in which a Null Strider attacks, the limb or organ used to make that attack is vulnerable to counterattack. Otherwise, no portion of its body form is apparent to regular dataform. Its body exists in what is essentially a higher dimension or another layer. They can batter every target in up to 3 adjacent frames on a single limb attack, inflicting 17 points of damage on a failed speed defense roll, or 6 points of damage on success. They can also insert a singularity-like orifice into the node once every few hours. Every creature in the node must succeed on a might defense roll. It takes 17 points of damage as portions of their form are sucked into the orifice. Each such attack also collapses roughly 1/5 of a node's frames. If all frames of a node are so collapsed, the node is destroyed. Wow, so they are incredibly powerful and destructive. We have the Pestilence. Its secured in ancient layers of the Datasphere are threats beyond imagining. Superintelligences that threaten the galaxy, perhaps all galaxies, eons in the past, finally defeated at great cost and eradicated. Eradicated, that is, but for minor traces that persist in forgotten information archives. One of these is a voice known as the Pestilence. Their motive is to dominate the universe. Okay, great. They have Deception as level 7. Their typical level is 4. They understand and craft Numenera as level 10. So they attack a target in the frame with a strobing ray of brilliance that inflicts 6 points of damage. On a failed intellect defense roll, causes another dataform to come under the Pestilence's direct mental control until it can escape. A similar attack in the real can target a creature within short range, affecting automatons, machines, and living creatures. Even if destroyed, a tiny copy of the Pestilence may be retained in any nearby machine, automaton, or other device, even a cipher. The best way to eradicate all such copies is to destroy all culpable devices. Wow, okay, so they really want to get out of there. And then we've got protocol worms, not a great threat, it says. They're like a dog-sized centipede. Gross. It's easy to see why someone unfamiliar with the creatures might underestimate them. The problem is they rarely remain alone or in small groups. In forced to defend themselves, they unfurl a needle-like proboscis, which inflicts 3 points of damage as it pierces a foe and injects a mass of miniature protocol worms. The target must then succeed on a might defense roll. The injected mass begins to consume them for additional 2 points of damage each round, until the victim succeeds on a might defense roll in one of their subsequent turns, or until they are dead, at which point their dataform explodes, releasing 1d6 mature protocol worms. Oh, gross. Okay, finally, then we have the Strovid. They are simple datasphere creatures that spend most of their time inert, feeding by passively absorbing small amounts of energy from a frame. They kind of look like weird red starfish things, as you can see here. They remain still for so long and grow so slowly that many explorers think of them like plants, but they're not safe to ignore. Once in a while, they can become aggressive and defend themselves. They have a natural ability to become a gestalt creature, with many individuals fusing into a larger data form. They attack by touching with their legs, draining a trickle of soul core energy and inflicting 1 point of damage. They fuse into a Gestalt creature, then a group of 5 of them is level 3. Every additional 5 Strovids increase the Gestalt level and damage by 1 to a maximum of 10, but damage can increase beyond 10 with more component Strovids. Generally, they don't fight to the death, however. They're basically simple animals. They're not intelligent creatures. Then there are certain real creatures that can appear in the Datasphere as well. So the Quidit, in the real, they are levitating spheres, not quite as large as a human head. In the data form, it's a hollow shell hosting controls, which apparently can remotely pilot an actual Quidit in the real. Yeah, you can interact with it and unlock it, and then you can use the controls normally and see into the real via the sensors mounted on the real-world Quidit extension. So kind of remotely piloting an actual Quidit. That's cool. You've got Datatars, which we saw in one of the previous Numenera bestiaries. Their data form is a large faceted eye with 3-dimensional halo of symbols and lines. Datasphere combat, they can use any attack available to the real form. It can encase an opponent in a temporary nested frame for 1 minute. They're generally hostile to explorers from the real, seeing their data-scribed forms as imperfect affronts. Then we have the Falling Maws. They were also in one of the previous Bestiaria volumes. So their data form is a glowing black sphere surrounded by pulses of energy that distort space around it like ripples crossing a pond. So the effect in the data sphere is similar to that of what happens in the real. sort of gradually drawn toward it. Juraskars, they have a data form of a twitchy swarm of eyes and floating teeth that scours frames for husks and live creatures it can consume, like a janitorial demon grown large and gone berserk. Their perception is level 10, wow. Intellect defense is level 4. Okay, so it can attack quite strongly in Datasphere combat as well. Lorica, horned creatures found in groups of 3. Their data form is a 3-sided solid, like a rounded pyramid-like shape or cylinder, with each side bearing an abstract face and one of the head symbols identifying the 3 individuals in the reel. They always exist in this combined form, never as separate creatures. They can strike creatures in the same frame with rays of energy that inflicts 7 points of damage, and it can also use the special ability as Trio has in the reel to make a ray attack. You can strike it to any frame in the same node it is in, although the attack is hindered for each frame the ray has to travel. Right. Then we have lore worms, holographic serpentine creatures covered in branching hairs. They are prone to lurking on the Datasphere side of Vertices. They can attack creatures in adjacent frames, but that is hindered unless there's an open barrier between them. They can be used as navigators or guides in the Datasphere, but they insist on being paid in ciphers or artifacts. Typically 1 device for each node the character wants to visit or explore. They place greater value on items that tap the Datasphere to provide information. We've got Murdins, they're hunched, dreary abhumans in the real world. Their data form is a golden-skinned, elaborately winged entity with elaborate garments. That's nice. Well, yeah, very fancy. Their low-level telepathic ability is something they can do, forge into golden lances they can hurl. They inflict 5 points of damage and stun the target on a failed speed defense roll. You'll use next turn. They can call up demon helpers as an action and animate them as an ally for 1 minute. Alright, and then finally we have Orgullian soldiers at level 6. When 10 or more Orgullian soldiers are encountered in the Datasphere, they manifest as a fused mind, appearing like a massive Orgullian head sans body. Okay, a fused mind can inflict a network scrambling pulse. It inflicts 7 points of damage on every creature in the frame. You must succeed on a might defense roll or begin to lose cohesion, dropping 1 step on the damage track. Oh dear. And then finally, we have the 2 adventures, which I'm going to skip through merrily with brief looks at the maps and cool stuff, because I don't want too many spoilers for players who might play this. But as you can tell, I really love this book. I've spent forever talking about it, and I apologize for that. But, by now you should be used to it. It's a really great supplement if you want to do a kind of very unique flavored kind of Shadowrunning Matrix experience in the Numenera world. They've really done a great job of putting that together, and there's different picture on these end papers at the end, by the way, which is a nice touch. Yeah, it's a fantastic book. It's a little bit hard to find here in the UK. I had to pay a little bit more than I would expect for a supplement of this size and length to get a real copy, but I really felt it was worth getting a real copy alongside the PDF because I definitely want to incorporate the Datasphere. It's my coming campaign. I think it's really great. The way they've outlined it, the whole real scribing, transcribing stuff is really cool. The different ways that things can be affected by being in the real or in the Datasphere are very cool. And there's so many interesting ways to discover information, Numenera plans, historical artifacts and lore. So I think it's really great. If you're interested in injecting some new life into a Numenera campaign and really sort of flipping the script and putting all the normal rules on their head, definitely pick this up. So that is Numenera, Voices of the Datasphere. I hope you've enjoyed my long blabbering about it. If you've got any questions about it, please do ask in the comments. I've really enjoyed reviewing this. I've really enjoyed all the inspiration it's given me, and it's an easy recommendation for me. But as usual, if there's any more you want to know about it, I'll try and fill in the gaps for you in the comment section. Until then, stay well, stay healthy, take care of yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. All right, bye-bye.